Also relevant to reciprocal reconciliation is what both sides contributed to the other in their history together. Both contributed to Australian identity. Indigenous peoples' main contribution was to share their land. Though the sharing was usually involuntary, it nevertheless makes ATSI people foundational for the nation. Moreover, that contribution was value-added. Down the millennia, Aborigines had shaped the distribution of plant species, especially through frequent controlled burning. They assisted colonists, guiding them to resources and pathways using their superior local knowledge. Later, some participated in the rural economy, for example, as stockmen. Elements of their culture were often adopted by the settlers, like ancient Celtic place names found throughout England. The large number of Aboriginal names for places and features across Australia signals their prior habitation and language. The same applies to names for implements: boomerang, didgeridoo, woomera, and flora and fauna: waratah, mulga, kookaburra, kangaroo, emu, dingo, brolga, budgerigar, and galah. By sharing the heritage of deep familiarity with country, Indigenous culture helped those who came afterwards develop a sense of place. Indigenous peoples, mainly Aborigines, contributed to Australia's identity. Anglo-colonists brought vast cultural capital, millennia worth of invention and accumulation across Europe and beyond in the realms of agriculture, science, medicine, industry, religion, law, politics, philosophy, the arts and literature. The First Fleet brought Western civilization, and with it the white race's extended phenotype, to the Great Southland. This included social capital distinctive to Europe, relatively high individualism combined with relatively low ethnocentrism and collectivism. Western Europe was on track to develop a tolerant cosmopolitanism that eased the life of minorities. At the time of the First Fleet, the English were still robustly patriotic with a keen sense of historical identity. They were capable of engaging in ethnic conflict, but they were also relatively individualistic and amenable to rule of law and empathy for foreigners. Most of the cultural and social capital brought to Australia had universal value because it was useful to people everywhere. This included a parochial cultural element, the English language, destined to become the global language of trade and science. As a result, the Aboriginal population, after its long period of isolation, was almost instantly transported millennia ahead of the trajectory of their unaided development. For all those gifts, Indigenous people should feel gratitude, if not to the people who brought them, then to extraordinary good luck. Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders have added a local texture to national identity in a way special to Australia, making them a founding people alongside Anglos. Due to disparity of numbers and economy, the Indigenous component was more significant qualitatively than quantitatively. The bulk of national identity markers came from Anglo pioneers and immigrants. If the continent had been devoid of people in 1788, Australia today would still be part of Western civilization with British characteristics. The convict influence helped the new nation jettison the aristocratic baggage of the old world. Evidence of the quantitative importance of Anglo identity in Australia and other colonies is their continuing familiarity across the English-speaking world, despite some differences in cultural admixture. Country was the massive quantitative contribution made by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Their contribution to Australia's cultural capital, and thus to its identity, was not special quantitatively, but qualitatively it was unique. No other national identity carries the golden Aboriginal threads of identity, folkways, art, language, names, myths, connection with country and race. Anglos should be grateful. White settlers came to identify with the whole continent, a result of the charting that was substantial by 1770 and completed by the 1830s. The early explorers became part of Anglo national law. In contrast, Indigenous peoples' familiarity with country was ancient but also local. Aborigines did not know that they lived on a continent-sized island because they did not possess maps. They had no name for the continent as a whole. It is true that Anglos settled on particular plots, which they named, Sydney, Van Diemen's Land and so on, but they were the first Australians to have an overview of their physical place in the world. Due to cartography, they knew they were settling a vast land, which they named. During that process, they had a collective self-awareness, something at first not available to Indigenous people due to limited communications. Aborigines did not have a collective version of themselves. Anglos did possess a collective conception of themselves and of the territory they were occupying. In the long run, none of this matters very much. Everyone now has access to the same information. Nevertheless, it remains a matter of fact that the first Australia-wide nation was created and understood predominantly by people from the British Isles. In 1901, the 6 self-governing colonies united to form the Commonwealth of Australia, a federal nation-state. They did so explicitly as an Anglo-nation, as repeatedly observed by political leaders during the constitutional conventions of the 1890s. The most famous example is the speech by Sir Henry Parkes, discussed earlier, in which he spoke of the crimson thread of Anglo kinship. In the background to these developments, the content of Anglo identity was being modified by ever-accumulating historical experience of the ATSI people. The thread of kinship now ties more and more Indigenous people and culture to the nation and vice versa. For most people with Indigenous heritage, assimilation is well advanced. Most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians have become or are becoming one with the Australian nation, undergoing change while causing change to the whole. Along with political enfranchisement, delayed in Queensland and Western Australia, Indigenous men began to serve in the armed forces. They fought in the 2 world wars, a fact known to their comrades and becoming more widely known today. Another example is Aboriginal art, which has become famous worldwide, but more importantly for Australia, has become part of our national culture. Its meaning rests on a foundation of our Aboriginal community remembered and lived. The Indigenous component of Australians' ancestry, however it manifests or is recorded, will forever retain the unique status of First Peoples. Many in the Indigenous rights movement claim that this is not enough. They want protection from a constitution that, while not completely indifferent, while raising no impediment to their full participation in politics or society, does not name them, does not recognise that they were here first, nor acknowledges their contribution to national culture and identity. Many Indigenous Australians think that the Constitution should include such recognition. Anglo-Australians should sympathise with this complaint because the Constitution also barely mentions them. Since the 1970s, that document has stood by, so to speak, while hostile elites attacked the country's founding assimilationist immigration policy. The resulting diversity has undermined civil liberties such as freedom of speech and of association, and it has set the country's founding Anglo people on track to become a minority within a few decades. Another cost has been to democracy. The transformation of national identity has been unpopular and could only be achieved by avoiding democratic process. Indeed, Australian Prime Ministers such as Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke admitted that if the Australian people had been given a choice, they would have rejected massive-scale, indiscriminate immigration. Similar processes have been at work around the Anglosphere, causing the state to de-license the founding nation. Perhaps the Constitution should be amended to help prevent and redress elite predation against the founding peoples, Indigenous and Anglo, just as the Magna Carta of 1215 pioneered rights against arbitrary rule. Changing the Constitution to protect its founding peoples should be done in a manner compatible with good government, which practically rules out interfering with the legally binding body of the document. Nevertheless, in principle, all founding peoples have an interest in amending their constitutions to protect them whenever the state apparatus, broadly defined to include cultural and administrative elites, turns rogue, as the Commonwealth has done for several decades against Anglo-Australians. Shared interest is the axis around which reconciliation should turn. Both sides, the nation and its Indigenous component, have an interest in good governance, as discussed at some length in the video concerning stakeholders. Indigenous Australians, like the rest of the population, have an interest in preserving the Commonwealth because they are citizens who share in the public goods flowing from the economy, society and government. it would be imprudent to ally with those who would wreck the Commonwealth's constitutional structure. Therefore, as proposed earlier, prudence indicates that any voice should be installed via conventional legislation or in a preamble to the Constitution, as proposed by former Prime Minister John Howard. Within that frame of shared interests, the two parties should state their needs and what they are able to concede. Before discussing negotiable terms, it is important for the sides to understand one another's basic conditions. So far in the referendum process, no one has been invited to speak for Anglo-Australians.